Hey everyone, I mentioned a while back that I had another map video planned, because maps are awesome and there should be more of them. I've already done a video showing the different nations that existed throughout the Third Age, so this time I've done something a little different, showing off different peoples that existed in Eriador in the Second and Third Age. I think of all the regions in Middle-earth, the history of Eriador is the richest and most interesting, and it probably has the most going on. Some of this video is speculation, as there is no way to be 100% accurate without the good word of the professor himself, but I'll provide plenty of explanation as I go through the years. Our first map here is at the start of the Second Age, the arbitrary year of 100. I've started in the Second Age as we know very little about First Age Eriador, other than the fact that both men and elves dwelt there. You'll notice in the west of Eriador live the elven peoples of the Noldor, the Sindar, and the Nandor. These three people make up the Kingdom of Lindon, ruled by Gil-galad. The Noldor dwell largely in the northern lands of Forlindon, whereas the Sindar dwell in Harlindon, where they are briefly ruled by Lord Celeborn. Beyond the River Lune are the Nandor, who mostly live a semi-nomadic lifestyle, spending their time wandering the vast wilderness. Some of them settle down for a while besides Lake Evendim, where they are briefly ruled by Lord Celeborn and Lady Galadriel. Notably, some men also settle by the shores of Lake Evendim too. These three peoples probably also mixed to a certain extent as they did in the First Age, but some Sindar were still wary of the Noldor due to the kinslayings of the First Age. Dwarves also live in the Ered Luin, the Blue Mountains. The great cities of Nogrod and Belegost were destroyed in the cataclysm that sunk Beleriand, but the text implies that some dwarves, greatly reduced, still lived in the mountains into the Fourth Age. Not much changes with them, so I won't be talking about them much. Further east are the domains of men. These are mostly men who never crossed the Blue Mountains into Beleriand. These men all live east of the Baranduin, the Brandywine River, and although some of them, especially the men of Eriador, venture into the Elven lands, they never actually make any settlements there. Speaking of the men of Eriador, they are largely related to the Númenóreans, being of Merakian and Baorian descent, and their language is similar to that of the Númenóreans. As a result, when the Númenóreans return to Middle-earth, they recognise their kinship with the men of Eriador, and the two peoples get along quite well. This isn't quite the story with the men further to the south, the Gwaithrim. These men are descended from the Haladin, who, despite being a Dain, are still quite different to the Baorians and the Merakians. They're less sedentary than their northern cousins, still very much living as hunter-gatherers and fishermen. Their language isn't related, and although later Gondorian historians recognise their relation to the Númenóreans, the Númenóreans at the time did not, and the two peoples ended up at odds when the Númenóreans started harvesting their forests for wood to build their ships. Speaking of forests, at this point southern Eriador is covered in forests, apparently so dense that according to Treebeard, a squirrel could go from Fangorn to the Old Forest without ever setting foot on the ground. It should be noted that there was probably a great degree of mixing between the men of Eriador and the Gwaithrim. I'll address this more later. We have other men too, the Hillmen, the men of Angmar, and the Lossoth. All three of these peoples are quite mysterious. The Lossoth seem to be descended from the ancient Forodwaith, men who lived in the north of Middle-earth. They don't really play much of a role in the events of Middle-earth. The Hillmen of what would become Rhudaur and the hostile men of Angmar are of unknown origin. It's possible that they're related to the Gwaithrim, but it's also possible that they're related to the ancient Easterlings of the First Age, or are perhaps a different group entirely. Tolkien never actually tells us, so all we can do is speculate. All of these people seem to live in relative peace, and you can see that Eriador is a real melting pot of different cultures and races at this point, probably its most prosperous period throughout its entire history. As time goes on, not a whole lot changes, and we reach the year of 1200. I chose this year because it's when the Númenóreans start to make permanent settlements throughout Middle-earth, although small and far between as of yet. In the year 750, Celebrimbor founds Region, and many of the Noldor moved to these new lands, and at around the same time, the Númenóreans build their first haven in Middle-earth, Vinjalonde, later known as Londair and Ned. Their influence slowly moves up the River Gwaithlo, the Grey Flood, but as their influence grows, so does their conflict with the local Gwaithrim. These conflicts erupt into violence, as the Gwaithrim attack Númenórean outposts or worksites, and the Númenóreans respond in kind. Due to this, the Númenóreans label the Gwaithrim as Men of Darkness, and the relationship between the two peoples and their descendants would never recover. Sauron also becomes active in Middle-earth at around this time. The machinations of Sauron would eventually erupt into catastrophic warfare at the end of the 17th century, the War of the Elves and Sauron. The name of the war doesn't really tell the full story, as Sauron isn't just fighting elves, but also those men native to Eriador. The Noldoran realm of Eregion is the first casualty of the war, being utterly destroyed by Sauron. Its survivors either flee east to Lothlorien or northwards to found the hidden refuge of Imladris, Rivendell. Meanwhile, the local Gwaithrim welcomes Sauron's forces, hoping that he'll deal with the Númenórean colonists. He does, but he also deals with the Gwaithrim, burning much of their remaining forests and driving them into the hills or coasts or surviving forests. As Sauron pushes north, he also destroys many of the men of Eriador, and eventually pushes to the frontier of the River Lune. The Nandor who live beyond are mostly either killed or flee, and Gil-galad's realm never extends beyond the River Lune after this war, which comes to an end in 1701 following the intervention of the Númenóreans. After this war, Eriador is something of a wasteland. Many of the native peoples have been obliterated or greatly reduced, and the forests of southern Eriador are completely destroyed. Thousands of years later, and many of these lands would still not recover. Now we jump forward to 3320, the year of Númenor's destruction, and as you can see, a lot has happened in this time. Númenorian colonists who have now founded Arnor have come to dominate much of Eriador, resettling much of Gil-galad's old realm and attaining lordship over many of the men of eastern Eriador. The Númenorians also control other enclaves east in the Troll Shores near Rivendell and south along the Gwathlo, where they have founded the city of Farbad. Farbad is actually garrisoned by both Arnor and Gondor, but seem to have a population largely dominated by native middle men owing to its location. However, some places are still largely populated by native men and native men only, who have split into several distinct groups. Those Gwaithrim who fled into the hills have become the Dunlendings, whereas those who fled to the coasts have become the Men of Erin Vaughan. That's not an official term to describe them, but they don't really have any other name other than fisherfolk. They are described as being fairly numerous, but barbarous by Gandalf in the Third Age. Some of them have fled north or survived in the north in the area around Bree, where they presumably absorbed the remnants of the original men of Eriador, the Beorians and the Marakians. I've chosen to label them as a different group, as although they're still closely related to the Gwaithrim in the south, they've become greatly different due to their adoption of the languages and friendliness of their northern cousins. So the men of Eriador at this point are a bit of a mixed race, likely consisting of Gwaithrim, Marakians, Beorians, and possibly even some Númenóreans of significantly diluted blood. As time goes on, they begin to look more like the Gwaithrim or the Haladin, probably owing to them having a greater population at this point. They spread south into the now empty lands of Menhiriath, which are populated by men who are referred to separately from the Dunedain of later Cardolan. Considering that the Gwaithrim were not friendly to the Númenóreans, the men who lived in this region could only be of the Men of Eriador category at this point in time. Now we move into 861 of the Third Age, in Arnor's fading years. The Númenóreans have now become the Dunedain, mostly the same, but their gifts, like their population, has dwindled since the War of the Last Alliance, and now the kingdom of Arnor has split into three rival realms: Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur. Arthedain seems to have retained a majority Dunedain population, allowing them to become the greatest of the three realms. Cardolan has a population of Dunedain in the Old Forest, the Barrow-Downs, and Tharbad, but most of their peoples in Menhiriath are implied to be middle men. Rhudaur, however, despite having an elite of Dunedain, has a large population of hillmen who aren't overly friendly with the Dunedain. Warfare between the three states would further grind down the population of Eriador, especially the Dunedain elite, and as the centuries pass, more and more of Arnor's lands are abandoned to the wilderness. Now we move on to 1409. This is an important year. Angmar rose 100 years ago, formed of orcs and the hostile men of Angmar, and has now struck a decisive blow against the Dunedain of Arnor. Those Dunedain of Rhudaur have now been killed or fled west, and Rhudaur is now fully controlled by hillmen in service to Angmar. Arthedain's defences along the Weather Hills were broken, allowing Angmar's forces to ravage the lands of Cardolan and those of Arthedain leading up to the North Downs. A remnant of Cardolan's Dunedain held out in the Old Forest and the Barrow Downs, and Cardolan's population of middlemen, whilst now greatly diminished, still holds on to much of southern Menhiriath. It should be noted that this population is quite sparse, and Cardolan is now little more than a rump state, unable to muster any sort of noticeable power. The ravages of time have also not been kind to Arthedain. The city of Anuminas is completely abandoned by this point, as are the fertile lands of what would eventually become the Shire. The rest of Eriador is largely the same, although elven populations in lands such as Lindon and Rivendell would undoubtedly be in decline, partly due to people moving into the west, but also falling in the wars against Angmar. Eriador's terminal decline would continue in the centuries to come, slowed by the coming of the Hobbits in 1600, but accelerated by the coming of the Great Plague in 1635 to 1637. King Argaled II grants the Hobbit explorers Marco and Blanco the lands of the Shire in 1600, as those lands, whilst fertile, have been abandoned by Arnor for centuries and serve as little more than a hunting ground. However, shortly afterwards, the Great Plague strikes, and it leaves pure destruction in its wake. The hobbits, whilst devastated, manage to survive. But the same cannot be said for many other peoples across Eriador. The Dunlendings and their coast-dwelling cousins are little affected owing to their isolation, but trade coming from the north-south road brings the plague into Cardalan, devastating Tharbad, and leaving the lands of Minhiriath mostly uninhabited for the rest of the Third Age. Those remaining Dunedain of Cardalan in the Barrow Downs and Old Forest are wiped out by the plague, and shortly afterwards the Barrow Wights arrive to haunt the deserted barrows. Arthedain manages to mostly avoid the plague, but the complete destruction of its southern neighbours leave it an isolated bastion of civilization in a sea of wilderness. Notably, the men of Bree also survive, because they're basically cockroaches at this point that can survive almost anything. The men of Tharbad also survive, but they're now unclaimed by either kingdom, as both Arnor and Gondor withdraw what remains of their garrisons. Next we reach the monumental year of 1975, which sees almost the entire annihilation of Eriador's remaining peoples, both good and evil. The Witch King of Angmar overruns Arnor, destroying much of the remaining Dunedain and ending the Northern Kingdom. He also overruns the Shire, but the hobbits survive. The situation of the men of Bree is unknown, but they also survive. However, Angmar is also destroyed by a counterattack led by Gondor, and the men of Angmar on the western side of the Misty Mountains are said to be completely wiped out. The Hillmen of Rhudaur also seem to be wiped out, as those lands are described as being completely deserted by the time of the War of the Ring, and ultimately become the haunt of trolls. With the closing of the Arnor-Angmar War, Eriador is almost entirely in ruins, and would have no noticeable recovery for the rest of the Third Age. Apart from small bastions of civilization such as Bree, the Shire, and Tharbad, one could go weeks without seeing another person, and the wild and untamed lands would become dangerous for even the most seasoned of travellers. The rest of the age sees little change. The Dunedain, now a scattered, wandering people, would found their seemingly only permanent settlement in the Angle, the lands between the Mephiphel and the Gwathlo. They would defend the remaining peoples of Eriador, operating in the shadows with little thanks from the locals. Further to the south, Dunlendings would spread into the lands around the Adorn and the Eisen as Gondor's influence in Calenardon waned, although their ambitions would come to an end with the eventual founding of Rohan a few short years later. The hobbits also moved back beyond the Brandywine River, claiming the strip of land between the Old Forest and the river as Buckland. Elsewhere, Eriador would remain silent, except for the occasional wandering bands of dwarves, elves, and seldom seen rangers. In 3017, on the eve of the War of the Ring, we have Eriador when Frodo travelled through it, as well as Bilbo about 70 years earlier. Little has changed in the last 1,000 years, and you can see why the inhabitants of places like Bree and the Shire have become so suspicious of folk from the outside world, because to them, the outside world is nothing but dangerous, untamed wilds travelled by no one except the strange rangers, the secretive dwarves, and the mysterious yet frightening elves. Southerners from lands such as Dunland sometimes travel up the north-south road, but mostly with nefarious purposes that the locals are untrustworthy of. The few civilized lands of Eriador are so insulated and so isolated from the outside world that their perspectives have ever changed. What lays within their boundaries are all they have ever known, and nothing outside their boundaries is worth taking note of, unless you want trouble. When Aragorn founded the reunited kingdom, civilization finally returns to the northern lands. But this would take time, centuries, possibly even millennia, and some scars from ancient wars and battles would never heal. The future people of Eriador would build their houses upon the ruins of those long-lost ancient kingdoms, inhabited by peoples whose names had been forgotten. Maybe one day the lands would return to the glory days of the early Second Age, but that is far beyond our scope of knowledge. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I plan on doing more of these types of videos for other regions in the Second and Third Age, as well as the First Age. I'm definitely not going to be neglectful of the First Age. War in Middle-earth is next, one of the final 2 episodes before the War of the Ring. Thanks, cheers, and remember, everything will return to nature eventually, including you. Sorry.